Are y'all ready to do this? Y'all ready to dig in, dive in? I feel myself, I don't know what it is, even during communion, my mind just like glitched out. Did you hear that? I was like, so if I have more glitches, just be patient. You know, mental glitches happen every now and again. And I'll tell you what it is. It's so funny to me that even when talking about being the generous giver, I shouldn't have been surprised that there would be that our finances and financial conversations would be confronted during that. And even now, while we're talking about Sabbathing, and if that's too churchy of a word, Sabbathing basically just means to cease, to stop, to rest. So we've been talking about stopping and resting. What area do you think is going to get confronted in my life? I realized that even throughout the course of doing this teaching, that I've not been resting well. And so when I have like glitches out, that's because I'm not resting. It's just the way it is. We have to rest just from a practical standpoint so that we can just function, right? And I'm doing good things, like I'm doing home projects, and I'm having my mind here at the church, and there's just other things. You know, it's all good stuff. But I've not been responsible with my sleep, with my resting. Yeah, I'm still reading the Bible. It would be good for you to know that your pastor reads his Bible. So those types of things are still happening, but the rhythm of my life is definitely eclectic right now. And so part of me feels a little sheepish, a little foolish to even be talking about Sabbath when I'm not even doing it well. I hope that doesn't offend anybody. Actually, I hope it gives you comfort to know that even your pastor is wrestling with this. I'm just wrestling with trying to find out what it means of what does God mean that he wants us to rest in him? What does that look like? And so today we're going to dig into that a little bit. One of the things, I'm not a musician. I don't pretend to be. I can play a guitar and I pretend to play a piano. I just make up stuff until Summer tells me to stop playing. And I found I don't even know if it's called a note. Are rests considered notes? It's just a rest on sheet music. And so I thought it'd be interesting to show y'all a whole rest, what a whole rest looks like. This is a whole rest. Now, there's also a half rest and a quarter rest. How many of you read music? Okay, is this accurate? I Googled it, so it has to be accurate, you know what I mean? So, but this is what came up when I saw whole rest. And it was like this aha moment for me when I was looking at this picture. I was like, man, that looks like something. And so in my mind, this is kind of what it looks like. Right? Whole rest. So go back to the other one, the music note. That's like an Atari version of a hammock. All right? That's basically what we got. We have whole rest. We see it in music where it's I don't even know how long of a whole rest. How long is a whole rest? Just like a whole measure. Well, what's a whole measure? Just like, so do you see a whole bunch of hammocks lined up when you want to rest more than once? Is that how it works? Like, I don't know. I legitimately don't know. But it's a whole rest. It's not a half rest or quarter rest. But what I think that we do, what we are experts of, are the quarter rest and the half rest in life. But what we're intended to do is this. And more accurately, we're supposed to do the next one, which is a hammock in the ocean. That, to me, is the epitome of whole rest. You know what's funny? Not funny, but interesting in this whole conversation of wholeness. Do you know that salvation doesn't just mean right standing with God? And I know that not all of you love to just dive into Greek words. I know that you don't find your mind being captivated by that. But I do think it's interesting that the Greek word for salvation is sozo, S-O-Z-O. And so sozo means not just right standing with God, that's righteousness, but sozo means wholeness. And so when we accept Christ, we are his children. We accept him. We accept the truth of who he is, and we are saved. But then from that point on, we are in the process of being made new. So we are in the process of being made whole. So if that's the case in salvation, I think that we are also in the process of figuring out what it looks like to have whole rest. How we can live this. Like, I want that picture to be a snapshot of what my life looks like. Now, my life, personally, it feels a little chaotic, not a smooth rhythm at all. I'm painting like crazy. I had no idea that the entryway of a house would take 2.5 weeks to finish. It's like, seriously, where does this trim and wall and spindles come from? I enjoy it, but I'm also exhausting myself from it. Whole rest. It's an invitation that God gives us. He wants us to live a life where we experience wholeness, where we're being made whole, where we are resting in wholeness. I want you all to turn to Matthew chapter 11. We're going to read at the end of Matthew 11 and the beginning parts of Matthew 12. And we're going to read about some encounters that Jesus has with some Pharisees. The word Pharisee may not mean a lot to some people in here, but Pharisee is basically just like people that are really religious. And what I mean by religious is not in a good way. They're just very legalistic, and they are more of whistleblowers than extenders of grace. Do any of you know whistleblowers? Anybody know a whistleblower? Where it's like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not spiritual. That's not what people in the church should do. We're going to look at some whistleblowers. We're going to look at how Jesus handles them. And all of this conversation is about whole rest. If I could smash any kind of image in your mind throughout the course of the morning, it would be a hammock by the ocean. If that sounds stressful for some of you, then just put your hammock wherever it's not stressful. If a hammock stresses you out because you get more tied up like a knot than actually enjoying it, then just put whatever you want to sit in the most comfortable setting, and then put your rear end there. And mash it in your brain. That's where I want you to be while we're talking about what we're talking about. Before we get started, I want to read this quote. It's from an intelligent guy by the name of Leonard Sweet. And he writes this about Sabbath. Our freedom from the Sabbath exacted a high toll. When we lost Sabbath, we lost spiritual well-being. It is not so much that we keep the Sabbath, in as much as the Sabbath keeps us whole, keeps us sane, keeps us spiritually alive. Genuine Sabbath keeping is not a series of you shall nots, but a string of celebrations. Its goal is not to shut you off from the realities of life, but to open you up to living. Very well articulated. Matthew chapter 11, we're going to pick up at the tail end, starting in verse 25. Just to catch us all up to speed, there's comparisons between Jesus and John the Baptist, and which is which and who's who. Jesus targets some cities that were not repentant, and there's all these questions of, there's this ongoing debate of who is Jesus and what's he about. The Pharisees definitely did not like him. They were actually following his gathering of people to blow whistle at everything that they saw him do that confronted what they believed in and stood on. And let me just tell you, church, that's what's frustrating to people who don't go to church. They feel like people who go to church are blowing whistles more than embracing them. You shouldn't go to those places. You shouldn't drink those things. You shouldn't say those things. You shouldn't do that, say that, be that, look that way. So the church, from the perception of people outside of the church, is just a bunch of whistleblowers. I don't want us to be known as whistleblowers. It's not our job. Now let me be very specific. The only time, I won't call it whistleblowing. I will call it accountability. Our job for those outside of these walls is not to blow a whistle at them. Our job is to love them. And by love, I don't mean like the way that we see love portrayed today. I mean unconditional, covenantal, mercy-motivated love. Now, once you're in here and you have a realization of who you are in Christ and you're growing in Christ, and where whistleblowing is legalistic and religious. Accountability is humble and with the desire to see you grow spiritually. Now, where accountability steps in is anybody who becomes a leader, whether it be a leader of any groups or OSL or back in the children's area, youth area. What you do when you step into that role is, and there's like a revelation today, accountability absolutely has to happen. And so we shouldn't be offended when we're not living and walking on the path that we ought to be walking when we're in leadership. Does this make sense? So it's not whistleblowing at that point, it's called accountability. Everything that the Pharisees do, it's not about accountability. They present it in a way as if it's spiritual accountability. It's just religious mumbo jumbo. It's not my desire. I'm really certain, based upon Jesus' interactions with all the Pharisees, it's not his desire that the church be excellent at blowing whistles. All right, there's a long introduction. I have 15 minutes to go through all of this. We're going to go late today. Just going to throw that out there. Be like 2 o'clock. Just kidding. Like 1:30. At that time, Jesus said, this is verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise, basically the revelation of who he is. You've hidden these things from the wise and learned, and you've revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I will give you whole rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they blew their whistles and said, Look, look, they're eating stuff. It's not a Greek word, so I just added that in there. Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. He answered, have you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater, if I were to rephrase this, it would read like this. I tell you that someone greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. I'm going to pause here before we read through the rest of it. The disciples were picking and eating, and the Pharisees saw this, and what they were, the way they lived their life is they were eager to point out and eager to accuse. They had their whistles ready, like in their mouth, ready to blow once the moment they saw something that they didn't agree with, the way that they lived their life. What's interesting is there's nothing that the disciples were doing that was wrong. From the perception of the Pharisees, this is how twisted and convoluted the whole subject of Sabbath had become. Do y'all remember in the Old Testament when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and in the 10 Commandments God says don't neglect the Sabbath? In Deuteronomy it says if you neglect to observe the Sabbath and remember the Sabbath, put that person to death. That's how serious they were on this conversation, because it needed to be such a radical shift in their thinking. They had to be serious about it. God couldn't be just blasé and nonchalant about, yeah, you can do it if you want, adopt this lifestyle if you want. He needed to have a hard line. Now, the hard line was made even harder throughout the course of history, and this is what the Pharisees were pointing out. They saw the disciples picking the grain heads off of, or the heads off of the grain and rolling it up and eating it. And they're pointing fingers at them. The reason they're pointing fingers at them is because there was a sub-point to the Sabbath. They did have a list of thou shalt nots. You shouldn't exceed, and I wish I could remember the fruit. It's not a prune, but it's something like the size of a prune. You could do this. You could pick the grains off of, you could pick the heads off the grain and put it in your hand, but it could not exceed the amount of some kind of dried fruit. They were legit on this. So I'm envisioning this. So did people on the Sabbath just like carry prunes around so that they could compare the amount that they had in their hand? Right? Like that's how religious they had become on it. Hey, your portion is off. You're sinning on the Sabbath. Pour some of that out of your hand. I mean, that's how ridiculous this was. I mean, if I was them, I'd like mash two fruits together so it made one bigger one because I like to eat food. And so, look, my prune's bigger, okay, so I'm good. And Jesus is saying, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Don't you remember? He goes right to the voices and the people of the Old Testament that they would hold very near and dear. He goes, don't you remember David? When he was fleeing Saul, he went to the house of God. And not only did he go into the house of God, but he went to the table that held the sacred bread, and they just grabbed some and ate it. And you're fussing at the disciples for picking off the heads of grain? Doesn't add up, guys. Does not add up. And then he goes, let's peel this back one more layer. Even the priests on the Sabbath, they're doing their duties within the tabernacle on Sabbath, therefore desecrating the Sabbath because they're working on the Sabbath and they shouldn't be working, and yet they, even though they're doing wrong, they're still innocent. They had become so rigid on what Sabbath was that they were more prone to blow whistles than to enjoy. See, that Jesus and the disciples, when they were walking through the field, it wasn't work. They weren't gathering to meet some quota for the day. They were just hungry. It wasn't work. This is important for us to understand because there are, we'll get to this in the next section, but there's good things that we can do on Sabbath that may look like work, but it's only work if it feels like work. Does that make sense? So we can do things, but the moment it slips into work for us, we need to pay attention to that. Now, let's not do what the Pharisees do and be like, oh man, this just, go in the refrigerator, it just feels like work. Honey, this feels like work to walk, so can you get me something? I don't think that's going to fly, right? So we can get sneaky about it real quick. We can get carnal about it, selfish about it. Let's not do that. But if something begins to feel like work, then we need to stop doing it. Let's enjoy the rest of God. Now, he goes on, and this is what I love about Jesus. Have you ever just paused and you're like, I just love Jesus. I love him in this story really, really, like, a lot. I know that's like super good grammar, right? I really, really like him like super a lot. You know, he's super cool. Okay. He has this encounter with the Pharisees out in the field, and he's just kind of like walking through, and he sees a synagogue, and he knows that they go to that synagogue. So he goes into their stomping grounds. He goes into their synagogue. I love this. Now there's a guy, imagine like, any of y'all like Frosted Flakes? Imagine like a big Frosted Flake at the end of your arm, and this man had like just a cornflake hand instead of shriveled up hand. I don't know why I just think of Frosted Flakes, but sorry if I ruined that cereal for some of you. I'm gnawing on somebody's hand right now. He goes, going on from that place, this is verse 9, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. He went into their place where they served as priests, served as Pharisees. He went into their place. How dare he? And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, the Pharisees asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because, we're not supposed to do any work. But something supernatural seems like work. So is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? I just love Jesus in the way that he communicates. He goes on, it says this, Jesus said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? You have to say it that way because there's an exclamation mark at the end of it. You have to pay attention to those type of things. Some people think that Jesus is like this wimpy guy. He got escalated in conversation. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep, y'all? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now, for me, I don't like sheep. I don't like anything that's remotely close to like the goat family. Seriously, y'all. Y'all go to the state fair? Have you seen the goats with the long ears and their eyes that go all like crazy? And they're like, yeah, they make all kinds of crazy noises. They creep me out. If one of those was in a hole on a Sabbath, it would stay there. Bad association for me. The sheep in a hole on Sabbath, how many of you would not reach out and take hold of it and pull that thing out? Jesus has proven a point here. He's like, man, you're again, guys, we literally just had a conversation out in the grain fields, and you're making a mountain out of a molehill. And here you have a man who has just a shriveled up hand. I don't know if any of y'all watch Betty White and the Mother's Day thing. Have you ever seen that? I'm only allowed upstairs. Anyways, you have to just look it up. It's really funny. But imagine these little hands. And he's just got this shriveled up hand, and Jesus saying, having this conversation, he says, I want you to stretch out your hand now. And he holds it out. And I don't know if it was becoming whole as he stretched it out, or if it was whole before that. All we know is that when it was stretched out, it was just like the other one. Now listen to the absurdity of what happens next. So the man, he stretched out his hand, and it was completely restored. It was completely made whole, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus on the Sabbath. You catch that? You guys are eating grain, picking grain. Will you heal this guy? I'm so sick of this, Jesus. Let's go. Come here. What's an idea? How can we kill him? All of that happened on Sabbath. That is the definition, the epitome of legalism. It's not okay for Jesus to heal a man with a shriveled hand, but it's okay for them to plot to kill Jesus on Sabbath. It's crazy. That's what religion is. When religion becomes do's and don'ts and restrictions, you're not enjoying the rest of God. If you are whistleblowing at other people and you're not looking at your own life and how restful you're being in the presence of God, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it, and I get frustrated with myself because I just fit myself in the slot of a Pharisee so quickly. It's frustrating. That's called being a broken person. I don't want to be the guy that's whistleblowing. I want to be the guy that's pulling sheep out of holes, because even though I don't like them. And I want to be the person that's available for God to work through, so that through my life, not me, but Him through my life can bring health and wholeness to someone else's life. Crazy. Pointing their fingers, blowing the whistle, and yet then they go off and plot how to kill Jesus. We're missing it. If we're looking for the fault in others, we're missing it completely. There's a massive disconnect. I mentioned this a few moments ago, and I would say that this is where people do get frustrated with the church. And now, by no means am I saying us, because we got our act together. I love how this flow of conversation is happening. If we go back to the end of chapter 11, see, the Old Testament, it kind of sounds like God is hard-nosed on Sabbath, and He's not. Well, it sure sounds like hard-nosed. If I don't Sabbath, then I'm going to be killed. That sounds like a pretty hard line. It is a hard line, but it's a hard line because He wants to set new parameters so that for the first time in 400 years, His children have a weekend. He's so set on them enjoying life that He wants them to enjoy a weekend. Enjoy a weekend or you're dead. But see, the older I get and the more I dive into the Old Testament, I don't see an iron fist God. Because this is what's striking to me. The same Godhead that had conversation with Moses on the top of the mountain that gave the 10 Commandments is the same person here where Jesus says, "Come to me." I want you to hear this. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. It's the same tone as Exodus when Moses is meeting with God on the mountain. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Y'all, as I get older, I know that my body is going to probably frustrate me because I will, in my mind, be always 25. But my body will remind me on a regular basis that I am not. Oh, yeah. But for anybody in here that's older than me, what my heart for you is, and what my hope for my own life is that my heart and my mind and my spirit would be more flexible than what I am right now. More pliable, more ready. I know that's horrible grammar. More ready to enjoy His rest. The older you get, we should not be more rigid and religious about resting in Him. You shouldn't acquire more whistles the older that you get. In fact, by the time we're ready to see Jesus, we should have no whistles at all. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. We have a loving Father. We have an incredibly loving Savior. And this rest, it's not a call to do nothing. It's not. But it is a call to, I think Sabbath, we could look at it practically and say, well, Sabbath needs to be a 24-hour window where we intentionally rest and turn things off and things like that. And I get that. But what I see in the New Testament also is more conversation about Sabbath being a regular lifestyle, not just one day of the week. See, what's interesting, and I'll finish with these couple thoughts. Jesus slept when others didn't. You remember the storm that about tipped over the boat? The disciples were like, so Jesus, you got to do something or we're going to die. He was asleep in the boat. He was Sabbathing in that moment. He was awake when others slept. He was praying when others slept. The garden, moments before his death, others were sleeping. And see, I so want to be Jesus. I want my rhythm of life not to be the rhythm of our culture. I want my rhythm to be like Jesus. Jesus was only not a delight to those who were religious. Everybody else, they embraced him. I want to be a delight to people.